Hello, so today I am really excited because we are painting one of my favorite things, the beach, complete with palm trees, paradise. So before we get started, I just want to remind you that you can paint along at your own pace. Just pause or rewind whenever you need to. And feel free to get as creative as you want or just follow along with my instructions if you're more comfortable with that. So the tools that you're going to need today are first of all, you're going to need a canvas, or you could even use paper if that's what you've got. I'm going to use a 16 by 20 today. You're going to want to have some paint. So I've got white, a little bit of black, some brown, yellow, and I use phthalo blue. You're going to want to have 3 different paint brushes. So we've got our large brush here. It's got a square end on it. You could use a round tip as well. But you'll just get a slightly different shape when we get to our clouds, and you'll see what I mean later on, but I prefer the square tip. I have a medium brush here, and I've got my small brush, which is a small angle brush. And then I've got my little jar of water and rag here so that I can wash and dry my brushes as we go. Okay, so let's get started. We are going to go ahead and grab our large paintbrush. We're going to dip right into that blue paint, just a little bit. So I'm just kind of getting the tips blue and then just giving them a light little swipe on both sides to take off the extra paint. And then we'll come up to the canvas here, and I'm just going to start out by creating the shape of the clouds that I want. So I like to make them kind of jagged, so I'm just going to create sort of these up and down jagged lines, which is why I like the squared off brushes. It gives you a little bit more ability to make these corners than a rounded brush does. Now this isn't going to be the final shape. You can always make adjustments. So basically what you want to look for is that you've got some high points, some low points in there, just to make your cloud a little more interesting. And then starting right at the top here, I'm just going to use my blue paint and go all the way right across. And while I'm up there, I am also going to paint this top edge, just start at that frame for my canvas. All right, so what I want to do is I want to start just kind of shifting my brush strokes a little bit. So instead of going straight across, I just want them to have a little bit of a smile. So I'm just curving it a little bit. And I'm just sort of filling in all of that space right above my clouds. So this is where you could slightly change the shape if you want to, but you will have another chance as well. And then I'm going to wrap that color right around my sides as well, just as low down as I've come with my paint. Okay, so I've got a little bit of choppiness happening up here just from some short brush strokes. So I'm going to take a minute and just kind of smooth those out. So I'm just making those big smile strokes right across the canvas. That's a little better. All right. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to start kind of creating the shape of my clouds here. So not the shape, start filling them in a little bit. So I'm just going to rinse out that brush. Give it a little dry out on my rag. And then I'm going to go in with white paint. And I'm just going to work to begin with kind of along the top line of these clouds. So I'm just following that shape that I've created. This is sort of your final chance to change that shape a little bit if you want to. You don't need perfect crisp lines at all, so don't stress out about that. Just kind of filling it in across the top, and now I'm just going to use this white paint to quickly just dab some of that in here. Just start to get some paint laid down. Little bits of blue in there are perfectly fine. We're going to be adding more in a little bit. Okay, so I've got white down about this far. I know that's a little bit hard to see. And I'm just going to wrap that around the side as well. Anytime you touch those edges, wrap it right around. Okay, so I've got the top of my cloud created here. Now I just want to start adding a little bit of blue back in, so there's a little bit more depth in my cloud, a little more texture, and so that it will blend nicely with the sky underneath. So I've still got a little bit of white here on my brush, but I'm going to go ahead and add just a little hint of blue, kind of just to the edge there. And now I'm just going to start pulling from the bottom of my cloud. So on the right side of my cloud, I'm pulling kind of towards the left. And on the left side of my cloud, I'm kind of pulling down and to the right. Just these like choppy brush strokes. And I feel like that's about all the blue I want in there, so I'm actually going to just wipe my brush off here, grab a little white, and just go in and soften some of these a little bit. Just lightening them up. A bit more white paint. Okay, so now we have these beautiful white, light blue clouds. They look nice and fluffy. I want to get a little bit of sky put in again. But before I do that, I want to get my next layer of clouds, because I'm going to have 2 layers. So my next layer of clouds shaped. So for that, I'm just going to use a light blue, much lighter than I did at the top of the sky. So I'm mixing a little blue and some white together. And I'm going to repeat that process of creating the shape. So I want this to be maybe just slightly above the halfway point of my canvas, close to halfway. And again, we're creating these bumps and these valleys. And then where I end this cloud, that's actually going to be my horizon line. So that should be somewhere around 1/3 of the way up the canvas, give or take, doesn't have to be exact. I'm just going to kind of put my horizon line in here. So that'll be the bottom of my cloud. And now all of this space above, I want to use this pale blue and paint in my sky. So our sky just gets a little lighter from the top down to the bottom. If you don't quite make enough paint, the nice thing with these sky tones is you can just quickly mix up a little bit more, and if it's not an exact match, that's okay. A few different tones of blue in the sky can actually be really pretty. So we're still sort of keeping that smile brushstroke going. Can add a few more of those little strokes up into the cloud if you need to sort of help blend the two together a little bit. And then once you've got that filled in, we're just going to wrap those edges. All right, and again, I'm gonna rinse out that brush. Dry it off really well. And grab a nice big blob of white paint so that I can fill in this cloud, just starting kind of on those outlined edges there. Adjusting the shape as I go if needed. And then we'll just blob in a little bit of white paint and give that a nice flat base where our horizon line is going to go in. All right, and then the one last thing we want to do is just, again, like we did up here, add a little bit of blue. I'm going to go in with my light blue into that cloud. So again, I'm going to pull from the right down to the left with all of these strokes. Getting a little color and texture in there. Okay, that should do it. Perfect, and just like that, our sky is done. And we're going to start working on our water. So we need a nice clean brush again. For our water, we want this to be a little bit of a dark blue again. So I'm just going back straight into my blue, same color that I used up in the sky. And I'm just going to start by creating this horizon line. So I want to go right across the base of this cloud. And we want this line to be as straight as possible. If you have a ruler handy, you can definitely use that. But I find a square brush, it's really great for doing these straight lines because you can kind of use that straight edge as a guide. All right, so I have my horizon in. I'm just gonna pull that around the sides. And now I wanna thicken that up a little bit. So I've got some nice dark water at the top. So these brush strokes are going just back and forth, nice and flat. And not too thick, maybe about an inch. I'm just thinning my paint out a little bit here because I've got some blobs in there. All right, and now I want to just switch colors a little bit. So because I've got palm trees here, I feel like I'm somewhere in the Caribbean. I want to bring in that really beautiful like aqua turquoise tone that the water has there. So I'm going to switch colors and get a nice turquoise here. So I need to get a little bit of yellow on my brush, just a tiny bit. We don't want too much because we don't want our water to turn green. And I'm going to mix that with some blue. And you want to see just a subtle change happening in that color. It's going to get a little bit darker on your palette. And you can kind of see as I spread that out, that beautiful turquoise. So right at the top here, it's going to be a little bit darker, so I'm just going to take that color as is and just put a line of that all the way across. And then I want to just slightly blend those colors together. It doesn't need to be a very good blend because we are going to add a wave over top of it later. But just with a quickly wiped off brush, I'm just going to pull it back and forth over where those two colors join. And then I've got a subtle transition now between my blue and my teal there. And as I work my way down, I want this teal to get a little bit lighter and much brighter. So white, and mix that right in. I'm going to put a little more yellow in there too. I'm still just working back and forth with my brush. Right up to where I left off, and I am kind of working back and forth a little bit on that seam again, just to help those two colors blend a little bit softer. We don't want a harsh line from the darker teal into that lighter teal. Okay, so before we go much further, I want to start to mark in kind of where my beach is going to be. So it's going to be on an angle, and I'm going to start it somewhere around here, and then just have it come down just above that bottom right corner of my canvas. That way I know not to color below that. So as I work here, I want to start angling my brush strokes a little bit more. So they're going to be a little less straight and a little bit more angled. And as I go down, I'm going to just keep adding a little bit more white to my color so that it's getting a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter as I go. Okay, and it doesn't need to be perfectly blended, so solid. If you've got like a little bit of streaking happening with different shades in there, that'll just add a little bit more movement to your water and look really pretty. So again, I just need to wrap those edges before I move on. All right, so we will come back into a little bit of that color shortly, just to kind of finish off our shoreline. But before we do that, I want to get some sand in here. So I do need to rinse out that brush. Gonna give it a little squeeze to get the water out. And now to create this color of sand, we want this like nice pale tan color. So I'm gonna take a little yellow. And you may not need the yellow in your sand, but my brown, it's pretty pinky red pigmented, so I like a little bit of yellow in there just to make it more golden brown. A little bit of yellow, some brown. And then I want a nice big scoop of white to really lighten this up. And there's lots of different colors of sand, so you don't have to stress too much. If you're, painting Bermuda, you might have pinkier sand. If your sand is a little wetter, it might be a little darker. Or if it's drier, it would be a little bit lighter. So I like my tone here. I just want to lighten it up slightly. A little more white. Okay, that looks nice and powdery to me. I love it. Okay. So I'm going to take that color right across where I ended off here with my water. Wrapping those sides, and you are going to want to wrap your bottom edge as well. I'm not going to because I always tend to drop my canvas whenever I try. But you want to lift it up and just paint right along your bottom edge just to completely finish off that frame around the sides. And I might throw a little bit more white kind of down at the bottom of my beach here, just so it's a little lighter. It would naturally be a little darker here because we've got wet sand from the waves. And then I just want it to be a little bit lighter as it comes down. Again, it just kind of gives you different tones. Creates a little bit more interest than having one solid color. All right. I want to make sure that it's nice and thin, the paint, right along that water edge, so that in a couple of minutes I can paint over top without the colors mixing together too much. So I'm going to give that brush a nice rinse, a good dry. And we do need to just let this sit for a couple of minutes just to let the top of that sand dry. So you can go ahead, you can pause, just, relax for a couple of minutes while that dries up a bit, and then we'll keep going. Okay, so we need to make this nice blend between our water and our sand. It's not a perfect blend because we don't want them to melt into each other. We want it to look like our water is just kind of laying over top of our sand a little bit. So I'm going to go back into this really pale watercolor that I've got here. Just a little bit, you don't need too much on the brush. You should be able to see your bristles through the paint. And now I'm just going to make sure I paint right down to the edge of my sand first. And now I just want to kind of overlap it a little bit. So I'm letting some of that paint go right over top of the sand. Don't worry if your sand is still just kind of slightly wet. Letting those two colors mix a little bit is perfectly fine. Water is see-through, remember, so it all works. And it doesn't need to be a perfect line here anymore either. So I've sort of created kind of a wave, kind of a dip here. So it looks like there's a wave just sort of coming up onto the sand. I'm just going to play with it until I'm happy. I think that'll do it actually. The other thing I want to do is just create a little bit more distinct edge on that wave. So I'm going to temporarily put down my large brush and pick up my small brush. And I ran out, so I'm just creating a tiny little bit more of that pale watercolor here. I'm going to swipe off my brush so that I can see those bristles. There's not very much paint on there at all. And then down here at the bottom, I kind of want to create this like foamy line. So I'm just going to sort of go along the shape of my wave should be slightly lighter, so you may want to add a touch of white. And I like to make this line a little bit wavy. It's not a perfect line. It can be a little sketchy. It doesn't all need to be perfectly connected either. And then just inside the water here, I want to show a little bit of movement as well. So like there's some little just light waves kind of rippling up. So same color, just very, very light, a little lighter than your water. Just adding more white. Swiping off my brush. And then I'm just going to kind of follow the direction of that curve. Just throwing a few light little sketchy lines in there. And then I'm going to do the same thing a little further up here. Only this time they're going to be a little bit straighter, just following the brush stroke that's in behind. Very, very sketchy. All right, and that's all I need the small brush for at this point, so I'm just going to rinse that out, set it down, and I'm going back to my medium brush, or my large brush, sorry. Give it a good dry. I'm going to add in a little bit of a bigger wave, so right where the water kind of changes color, I'm going to grab a bit of white, just on the tips. Give it a little pat off, because I don't want too much paint. Try that again without brown. There we go. And then right along where that water changes color, I'm going to make sure my bristles are horizontal. And I'm just going to kind of do some dabs all the way across. I'm going fairly straight here. It can be a little thicker in some areas. Just like there's a nice big wave out there kind of curling over. All the way across the canvas. Wrapping the side. And I think I want to add just a touch of this sort of darker blue down into my water here as well. So I'm just going to grab just a small little bit of it on my brush. And then just sort of mix that with a little bit of the other watercolor to soften it a little bit. There we go. Just adding a few different tones into that water. It just creates depth and movement. So that's it for our background. We've got that completely done. We need to work on our foreground a little bit now. So we're going to add in some palm trees, a little bit of a hill on our beach, and then some shadowing down in the sand. So the first thing that I want to do is I just want to sort of figure out where these palm trees are going to go. So I need to figure out the trunk placement. And to do that, we're going to use our medium brush. You want to make sure that your brush is a nice flat one for this. If you don't have a super flat brush, you could use your small brush as well. The only problem is when you use a small brush and you're doing like really long, tall lines like this, you may run out of paint before you get all the way up. A medium brush, this one will hold a good amount of paint, so we'll be able to get all the way up here. So I'm going to grab a bit of brown, and I want my palm tree trunks to be quite dark, so I'm also going to grab a little bit of black. Just Just a tiny bit, mix it in. I kind of want to go for dark chocolate here. A little bit of black at a time till I get the color I want. That looks about right. And I'm going to swipe off that excess paint. And I'm actually going to add a little bit of water to my brush as well. It's a little water, give it another little swipe, and that's going to help it continue all the way up without running out of paint as well. So the first one I'm going to do is like the main tree, the nice big tree that's going to be smack in the middle of my other trees. So I'm going to start that maybe like 3 or 4 inches from the left side of my canvas, just near the top of my sand. And I'm holding my bristles so that they are vertical this time. I'm going to press down on the canvas really lightly, and then I'm just going to start to pull up. And I want this to end just kind of below my cloud line. Okay, so we've got one tree in. Let's plan out where our next tree is going to go. So I'm going to put it right beside, pretty much right at my shoreline here. And this one I want to curve the opposite. So I'm going to kind of curve it out a little bit to the right and then swerve it back up so it's almost touching my first trunk. Palm trees always kind of have a little bit of a bend to them. And then my third one, I'm going to start just sort of on the shoreline. It's just going to be a small one. It's kind of in the back here. And I'll bend it up to the right. So it's ending just, I'll bring that just a little bit above where my water ends there. So I've got my 3 trunks. They're a little bit too skinny at the moment. So I need to thicken those up just a tiny bit. So I like to keep them pretty thin at the top here. So I think I'm just going to pretty well leave that thickness it is. But then as it comes down, I want to thicken it up a little bit more and kind of create a little bit of a bump at the bottom on one side. Just sort of flatten that off there. Same with this one. Keep it thin at the top. Thicken it a little bit at the bottom here and flatten it off. And then the final palm tree. Thin at the top, a little thicker at the bottom. Okay, so rinse that brush nice and clean. One other thing that we want to do to these trunks is, it is bark, so it's going to have a little bit of texture. So I'm going to use my small brush here. And I want to create kind of a lighter version of this brown. So I'm just going to grab a bit of white, mix that in. I want to make sure there is a pretty big difference between the 2 colors so we get good contrast. All right, so with a little bit of this paler brown on my brush, I'm going to kind of pick one side of the tree. So I'm going to use the left side of each tree trunk, and I'm just going to pull across. So across, across, and I'm just working my way up the tree. And as I run out of paint, I'll just grab a little bit more. It's really important though that you have like hardly any paint on that brush to start. I'm just kind of pulling across all the way up. You can miss a few spots here and there too. It doesn't need to be perfect all the way. It can have a little bit of a curve to it too, almost like a smile. And that will just sort of help to make your tree appear more round rather than flat. Okay, I'm gonna rinse that off, give it a quick dry here. And now I want to start to map in where all the leaves are gonna go on my tree trunk here. So I wanna have sort of this bones, I like to call it, kind of, it's the veins of each leaf mapped out. So I'm just gonna mix up some green. So I need to grab some yellow and some blue. I'm just gonna push these together to mix up a nice dark green. And make quite a large amount of this because we're gonna be using a bit for getting all these trees nice and leafy. And to that, I wanna take a nice big scoop of brown and put it right in. And I might take another big scoop of brown. Sometimes you need 2 or 3 scoops. What we're looking for is a nice dark olive green. All right, I think I'm there. So I'm gonna swipe off that excess paint. And I'm gonna come up and I'm gonna start with my largest tree. And I'm just gonna kind of map in where I wanna put these branches. So I'm gonna have one that kind of comes down, one on the other side. You can have a little curve to them, they don't need to be straight. Bring one out this side, up. That looks good. I usually like to bring 6 or 7 of these palm branches on each tree, and I'm going to do that again on these trees down here. So this one's just going to kind of come in behind. So I did 5 on the small branches and maybe 6 or 7 on the big one, big tree. And then I'm going to switch. I'm going back to my medium brush. So same color. Swipe, swipe. We want those bristles nice and flat. And I'm going to start with my small tree and then end with my large tree. So I'm going to start down here. And basically what I'm doing, I'm going to show you actually on a plate here, just up close. So what I'm doing on each branch, if that's my vein, I'm going to start from the middle of the tree, lightly press my brush down, and I'm just pulling down. And I'm kind of releasing the pressure as I lift off. So that's going to give it sort of that really leafy, fluffy texture. And sometimes I'll go through it again. Don't be afraid to pull these nice and long. And then along the top of the branch, I just do a few kind of shorter ones. And that is going to be the process for every single one of these branches. If you want to do a practice run like that before you hit your canvas, you absolutely can. But I'm going to start here and I'm just going to pull down all the way underneath that branch. Take a second run through. And then just a few up on top. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the next branch. Light pressure, we're not pressing hard. Just be careful around that trunk because remember this tree is in behind. This tree's also behind, so I'm just kind of being careful around that trunk. But can always touch up our trunk if we need to. Always swipe off your brush when you load it with more paint. Remember, one side of your leaf has those long strokes, the other side, it's a little shorter. All right, so my two sort of background trees are done. Now I'm gonna do my big one. And they're all gonna overlap a little bit, which is fine. Just imagine like those other ones aren't even there. And do each branch on its own. You can really master that technique of sort of letting go of pressure as you get sort of towards the end of your little flick. It really it gives them a nice fluffy look on the end. They look really natural. Last one. All right, so the next thing that I want to add in a little bit here is just some highlights. So they look a little bit too flat right now. I want to pull out some brighter spots or some highlights in these leaves. So to do that, I'm just going to add a little bit more yellow to a little bit of this green here. Kind of mix in a good amount of yellow there. And a bit of white so that we get just a slightly brighter version of that green that we've been using. Might do it over here out of the way a little bit. There we go. Swipe off the excess. And now I'm just going to go through these trees and pick and choose. I'm not going to go over every single branch or every single little fluffy mark that I've made. I just want to pick and choose a few spots where like maybe the sun is kind of shining down on that tree a little bit. And it's the same technique, I'm just sort of doing the little pull downs. Or up, whichever direction. I find kind of the tops of your branches or the top leaves of your trees would naturally have a little bit more highlight. The bottom would naturally just be a little bit darker. Perfect, and if you feel like you need a little more contrast, you could always go through and do that again. But I think I love this spot right here, so I'm just gonna leave it alone. And lastly, I want to do some detail down on the beach here. It'll kind of help some of these trees blend in a little bit more as well. So I'm going to go in with some of that dark brown, the same color that I used on my tree trunks. And I'm going to kind of create this little bit of a hill. So just sort of at the bottom of my trees here, I want it to kind of end up there on a point. And I'm just using small little strokes here, kind of in behind my tree bases. It's okay if a little bit of your sand color peeks through. It doesn't need to be so completely solid. And don't worry about what the top looks like because we are going to treat that in a second. So I'm just sort of pulling from like the upper left down to the right a little. There's not a lot of paint on my brush. I'm going to wrap that around a little bit. Just so it looks like there's a little bit of a hill happening here. Slightly lighter color, just sort of go over top. Especially at the bottom edges here. It'll just help it to blend into the lighter sand a little bit more. All right, and now on top of that, to clean that up, I'm gonna put just a little bit of greenery. So I'm just gonna dab out my brush here, clean it, dry it, grab some of that dark green from my trees, and just sort of dab. Like there's a little bit of a grassy or a bushy area in behind here. Yeah, don't worry too much. If you paint over your tree trunks a little bit, we can go back in and touch those up. So make sure that the top of this is nice and irregular. We don't want it to be straight. We've got some high and low spots. All right, and again, just like we did with our tree, I'm going to go with a little tiny bit of that brighter green. Just throw in a few little dabs of that, just to give it some texture. Okay, and then last but not least, we want to do some shadowing of these trees. So same colors that I was using there, that dark brown. I'm going to come down onto my sand here. I'm just going to raise this a little bit. Down into my sand and kind of just under where my trees are. So I might start where my large tree is, and because it's bending this way, my shadow is going to bend this way a little bit. And I want you to imagine you've had a lot of caffeine and you've got the shakes. So your hand is going to just be shaky. And we're just going to scribble. So right at the base of my tree. Scribble, scribble. I'm not doing like an exact image of my trunk. It's just a little bit more natural, I think, to kind of just create scribbly lines underneath. And now I'm going to come over and do the same under this tree. So right underneath the base here, kind of following that angle too. And under this tree as well. And then I'll go in with a little bit of that lighter color on top. All right, the only thing left to do is just touching up those tree bases if you need to. So a little bit of that dark, dark brown again. Just gonna clean them up where I kind of got some of those other colors over top, behind the trees or on the ground there. Put the little highlights back in if you need to. And that's it. Other than that, of course, you're going to want to sign that beautiful painting. So just grab your small brush. If you have it a little bit wet when you go to do your signature, it will go on a little bit smoother. And I'm just going to use the very, very pointy tip, press really light. And you can do your signature bigger or smaller. It really doesn't matter. Okay, we are all done. I hope that you enjoyed the journey of creating this beautiful beach painting. If you can't be on the beach, painting one is the next best thing, right? So I would love to see a photo of your finished painting. So if you click the link that's right underneath this video, that will take you directly to our member forum where you could post a photo of your painting. You could ask me questions there if you've got any at all, or you could just chat with other members and check out their paintings too. So have a fantastic rest of your day, and we will see you next time. Bye.